Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome.
We are the Imaginaries. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we're breaking a little bit from what we've done before. We're going to be in conversation with a book called The 7 Beauties of Science Fiction by Csicsery-Ronay. We're not critiquing this book. We're not reviewing it in the same way that we've thought through some of the books of science fiction we've read in the past. This is a more academic book of criticism about science fiction, and we don't want to engage directly with it. We're not going to be responding to what he puts forward in this book. Rather, what we're going to be doing is using some of his ideas and building on them, using some works that we like to support what he says, to maybe think a little bit more about what he says with works that he doesn't include in here. So even though we're going to be using this book as a reference a lot, we're not looking at it directly.
Basically, we're stealing what we like from it.
Yes, exactly. This opening chapter, the first beauty of the 7 Beauties of Science Fiction, will be the subject of our podcast today, and we're going to do other podcasts in the future that respond to the other 7 beauties, because this book is really well put together, really well researched, really interesting to think about. So we'll use it as a structure in the future. With that said, if you don't really dig what we're doing today, don't assume that the next 6 podcasts are definitely going to be the same thing, because we're going to mix it up a little bit. We're just going to do some interesting things that we haven't done before, responding to a book of criticism.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that what really appeals to us about the 7 Beauties of Science Fiction as a book is its structure and how it cycles through different organizational principles of looking at science fiction. So while the actual content on the page may or may not jive with what we're interested in talking about on a given week, we will be using his book, fittingly, as an organizing principle for some of our podcasts. That's essentially what it boils down to.
Yes, so today, like I said, we're going to be thinking about the first beauty, which Csicsery-Ronay calls the Signa Novae. We're going to think about this in 6 different ways, or respond to 6 different things that he included in the first beauty. We'll go through those more or less in order, but just to give you a preview of what's coming in this podcast, we're going to talk about what the Signa Novae allows as far as science fiction goes.
What do you mean by that, Tony?
We're going to talk about the Signa Novae as how it defines science fiction.
Okay, but can we talk about what the Signa Novae is first?
Hang on. Let me go through the table of contents, and then we'll actually get into that. So we're going to start with what the Signa Novae does for a definition of science fiction. Then we'll talk a little bit about alien nouns and verbs, what it means to make an alien word, what it means to make an alien language, thinking about linguistic science fiction, because we like language.
We love language.
As we've already shown you with Luna New Moon and Dark Eden. Then we're going to talk a little bit about language as power and finish it up with what language does to actually create what language does to create a fully fledged artificial culture. But before we do any of that, let's talk about what Signa Novae actually is.
Please.
Yes. So do you maybe want to take a first stab at that?
Well, my first stab is going to be a pretty amateur one. So I discovered this book just a couple of weeks ago, and I am working my way through it as we speak. I'm about at the 3rd beauty. My understanding of the Signum Novae is that it's essentially a catchy Latin term for how language manifests itself in science fiction, specifically alien languages, or if we're talking about technologies of the future in a hard science fiction book, talking about how those terms also manifest in the literature. So it's like basically new words, just looking more specifically at what they do for us as readers. And I think the most interesting application is in texts that we love. So we will get to talk about some of the texts that we love. I do believe Cough, cough, Klingon might be mentioned at some point in this podcast. And we'll probably also talk about some other texts like Dune. The Left Hand of Darkness is also a book that is mentioned specifically in the Seven Beauties. Basically, we're going to talk about language and how it works. Is that right? Or did I just very ramblingly put us off topic?
No, I think that was a great definition. That's how I understood it, essentially. And I think it was really smart, both for you to provide that basic definition, but also for this book to start with language new language, new words, as really important to science fiction. Because I think that there are a lot of works out there of criticism, academic criticism, other podcasts, fan creations, that think of science fiction in terms of the plots, or in terms of world building, or in terms of the character arcs, or something like this. So to put language in this book as the first beauty of science fiction, I think was a really smart move. The first thing that I want to talk about in this chapter is a definition of science fiction. So Csicsery-Ronay on page 19 of my version of this book.
And let us remind you that we will not be extensively quoting from Csicsery-Ronay, if that's actually how you pronounce his name.
Yes.
But we will be referencing him occasionally.
Most definitely. When we move from large point to large point, you may expect us to reference something that he has in this book. But we're not going to be responding directly to it throughout. With that said, what he says on page 19 is, if science fiction is a quintessentially estranging genre, it is in its imaginary neologies that this estrangement is most economically condensed. Which not only gives him permission to put language at the front, but also furthers this idea of science fiction as primarily estranging. Not just strange, not just weird, but actually trying to build this gap between reader and writer, between reader and idea. It's meant to give you this feeling of estrangement. And I wondered, because when I read that, I had a strong response that was both, that makes sense, but also that doesn't feel right. So I wonder, what was your response? Because you just had a little bit of a response to science fiction as quintessentially estranging.
I do. I have a big response to it as quintessentially estranging, in part because I suppose for me, as a kid growing up reading science fiction was it was a medium that actually helped bring me home and bring me into relationship with people. So in terms of its social function in my life, science fiction was the opposite of estranging. It did not separate me out from the things that I loved or the people that I loved. It actually brought me closer to them. And it was one of the few things that I still continue to this day to share with my quintessentially estranging Republican family. I am, of course, having mentioned this earlier, I'm fairly liberal leaning. So, I always thought of it as something else. But I think what he's getting at when he says quintessentially estranging is that the dynamic upon which we rely in science fiction is that we are not somewhere yet that we will eventually be, or that we could eventually be. And that not yetness of science fiction could be estranging, or that could be his definition of estranging, in that there necessarily is an implicit gap between reader and the world or the timeline in which the book is set. I don't know. Does that sort of strike you as what he's trying to get at, or? And they use language to do it, to show evolution or progress.
Yes, and yes. And I think that what I want to talk about is not necessarily what he means, but rather, what we understand him to mean. And what's most important, thinking about the conversations that we've had in previous podcasts, is that owning this sort of quintessential estrangement of science fiction via the language it utilizes is something I think that we both appreciate about the genre.
Yeah.
Like, it is something that, for example, the queer perspective, at least as I embody it, really appreciates about the genre. Even though, if you remember back to our Luna New Moon podcast, we had some trouble with the loan words, the language that was created on the moon. But the idea of a word, for example, that means essentially the same thing as spouse or partner carries some legal weight as well as some relationship weight, as well as some things that you can't necessarily describe because they are encapsulated within this word that is the word itself, that we define this word as the thing that it is. And I think that's really cool, and that's sort of like where the estrangement comes from. We find words in science fiction that we don't find elsewhere, and therefore we have ways to express ourselves because of what we've read, because we feel quintessentially estranged. Because
it's a playground as much as it is a work of personal philosophy.
Totally, yeah. And, like, you know, words from different works of science fiction have entered the canon. The word I'm thinking of first here is grok. But we'll talk a little bit about Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, as does Csicsery-Ronay, and kimmer is another word that is very interesting, very useful, has been, was used by Le Guin in her novel to describe a very specific process that doesn't have any referent in human society, in human biological processes, anything on Earth.
Okay, so explain quickly what kimmer is for those readers or followers of ours who haven't read The Left Hand of Darkness.
Oh, Lord. I gotta look this up real quick.
He is frantically flipping through his pages here.
So, in Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, kimmer is a word that describes the process by which the alien Gethenians, who normally are genderless, actually manifest gender in order to reproduce. And then once they leave kimmer, they go back to being genderless. And before they enter kimmer, they don't know what gender they're going to have. So within this book, the word kimmer refers to something very specific, which humans do not have, which is not unknown on Earth. In terms of life on Earth, this is something that I believe could happen. I know at least of some examples that are similar to this. But there's no direct reference, there's no direct equivalent for humans. But what some fans did after this book came out is sort of took this word, repurposed it, owned it, used it to describe things that they couldn't describe with other words, but were functionally similar, metaphorically similar to what Le Guin did with this book and gender.
Sure.
Which is super, super cool. And that's I think that's one of the powerful marks of science fictional language. And again, sort of owning that estrangement that Csicsery-Ronay talks about here. So, shall we move on to our next large point? Alien parts of speech, nouns and verbs. Specifically, maybe the predominance of alien nouns in the science fiction lexicon.
Yeah, well, I think it makes perfect sense that as a writer, it makes perfect sense to try and lend your alien speech a sense of otherness by altering first your verbs. And we saw this a lot in Luna New Moon. You see it in other works of science fiction as well, when specifically you'll be given an alien technology or an alien state of being or an alien name for a person, place, or thing, and it has a foreign sound or construct to it. This makes sense because it's easy. We can conceive of other things as having other names, but it's harder for us to conceive of other processes and actions. Like, it's harder for us to actually conceive of actions that we do not ourselves use, and therefore, why would we name it anything other than running or walking or playing or eating if, in fact, we can use these regular verbs and I should say in English, those are regular verbs, but we should use our regular terrestrial languages to describe regular terrestrial style behaviors, even if aliens are doing them. Because if you don't use human terrestrial language to describe a very common behavior, it comes off as feeling rather fake. And I don't have a lot of examples of this that leap to mind, but you can imagine a situation in which an alien is eating, and maybe you call it peeving or something. He peeved his toast, or he peeved his... I'm sorry. But, like, you understand what I'm saying. It automatically comes off as hokey, because why would you use anything else to describe a terrestrial behavior or a terrestrial style behavior? So if you conceive of an entirely new process, which Kemmer could probably operate as a verb as well as a noun to describe the process, it makes sense that something that is so definitely other as a behavior could have an other word to describe it, or it would be in another language. But I just think that writing verbs or creating verbs, generating verbs, peeping in another language is just like it's just intrinsically hard, whereas creating nouns is easy. So I can see why the vast majority of science fiction texts would first turn to noun creation, and then if they happen to get really ambitious, maybe move on to verbs and other parts of speech. But I mean, I'm pretty sure I've seen a lot of ESP in those triangular brackets or in extra brackets to kind of just indicate, they're kind of like tags for when you have ESP or mental speech going on. But I don't really see a lot of experimentation with punctuation. Maybe you can think of some examples that run counter to this trend, but I mean, think of Ready Player One, think of Orcs and Crake, think of Mary Julia Russell. I mean, all of these authors regularly introduce loan words, and that's fine. That's really fine. But it can get frustrating because it doesn't feel inventive.
Yeah, and I think part of the difficulty in inventing verbs as well is that, no matter what sorts of aliens we're dealing with in science fiction, whether they're Star Trek aliens with a little bit of forehead makeup, or whether they're, giant space squids or intelligent hive minds, artificial intelligent hive minds, or space whales that live in space, or completely unknowable beings that live on the surface of neutron stars, we share verbs with them. They think, they act, they move, they live, or they...
I mean, are we really capable of imagining an other so other that they don't share common behaviors with us? I mean, isn't that one way of making alien stories accessible, period?
Exactly. And I think you're exactly right about that. And that's one of the reasons I would suspect why you don't see a whole lot of alien verbs, because for all the reasons you just so eloquently stated, it's really easy to make an alien noun and make your reader think, well, this sounds alien, like now this is something I've never heard of, but it's something I could reach out and touch or think about or see or, experience in some way. Whereas like if you introduce a verb, an action that's completely alien, that's much more difficult to get a handle on.
Yeah, I mean, and even with the Gathenians and Kemmer, in most ways, the Gathenians are human in behavior, in social structure. I mean, their transformation biologically has affected their social structure, but it's still recognizable from economics classes, from social history classes. We understand how they work. If they were to be an entirely other species and Kemmer was just one of many behaviors that we didn't share with them, I think it would be a lot harder for the book to actually appeal.
Yes, I agree.
And I think that brings us to an interesting point, which is, picking and choosing your battles really matters. And language is one way in which you can pick your battles. and pick them really specifically and target them to really specific points that you want to make. So Cameron allowed Le Guin to raise conversations about gender and the role of gender and its interaction with sexual orientation, gender and sexual orientation both, but their interaction with each other, and its power to shape culture. And I think that very targeted conversation is fascinating. It could have gotten lost in the white noise of all these other behaviors that were alien, but she chose not to include those other behaviors. So what we're left with is one argument, essentially, for the role of gender and sexual orientation in social structure. So I think that provides us a lot of meat that we could dive into, but maybe we shouldn't. I don't know.
Just to throw in that when we're referring to alien verbs, we could think of alien verbs in a couple of different ways. The way that we're using it is a new word that also describes a new process or a new action. So both the word and the action are unfamiliar. You could also have words that describe familiar actions just under alien names. And actually, Csicsery-Ronay gives kind of a shady call-out when he says, if alien words for fucking, foreigner, slave, and master were removed from the megatext, the number of alien words in science fiction would probably drop by 3/4.
Do you think he's upset about how many foreign words there are for fucking?
No, absolutely not. I think he thinks it's funny.
Oh.
But like all those alien words for fucking are really describing a process that is essentially, similar to what we would think of as sex. I would guess that most of the books in which new words for fucking appear are not describing a process that's sort of similar to sex, but is a completely new thing. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, and I think we're pretty unimaginative about how we portray sex in general and in science fiction both. So it would be interesting to create a study. I don't have time for this, but it'd be interesting if someone else had the time to put together a study looking for just like putting together the data on how many times authors come up with entirely new sexual behaviors or variant sexual behaviors with alien terms attached, or how many times that alien term simply indicates regular plain Jane boring old sex. Which, we have to admit, it's kind of hard to reinvent the wheel, but someone should, because I'm bored. I say that as an asexual, too, so,
I think the big question there for me would be, in response to what you just said about gender, like, what is the author choosing to do by trying to reinvent sex? Is it talking about reproduction? Does it have to do with pleasure? Does it have to do with social construction? Does it have to do with societal construction? What's going on there? And I think that, that's something that you could read a lot of and not really see all of that considered, but would probably want to consider all of those things because, if you're trying to think of a completely alien verb, a completely alien action that has some similarities to sex as your readers will be able to engage with it, there's a whole lot to think about in terms of what sex means, what meaning, that.
No, I 100% agree. I think that sex as a function of gender, biological or otherwise, and as a function of behavior. There's a reason why it crops up so often in literature of all kinds, and it's because it is foundational in a lot of ways. It allows us a common language to talk about other things too. So yeah, I think I don't argue with sex being a major component of science fiction. In fact, I welcome it and embrace it. And I think if we want to talk about sex in science fiction, we need to talk at length about Octavia Butler and various other authors where sex, gender, reproduction, pleasure, coercion, consent, all of those issues are tied up and maybe maybe interrogated separately, but within the same text, because I think it's so rich. It's so timely. That's the crux of what's going on Tumblr these days.
Yes.
That's essentially an abbreviated Tumblr, Tumblr post there. So
Yeah.
Okay, but let's move on a little bit. I'm interested in getting to another interesting function of language in science fiction, which is the universal translator. And I wasn't sure if you had anything to say about this. I know that you came to Hitchhiker's Guide a long time before I did. So do you want to talk about what that means for literature?
Yes. I know exactly what you're talking about. I had it written down. There we go. Okay, page 34. So, there are devices in science fiction that Csicsery-Ronay identifies as universal translators. And in fact, he uses Star Trek's universal translator and the Babelfish from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as his two most easily accessible examples. They're also the two examples I thought of first, so I don't know that I have a lot to add as far as examples go. But what he says that's interesting about this is that both of those rely on this assumption in science fiction on the part of science fiction authors that verbalized languages are all reducible to a basic stratum. And essentially what he means by that is that a universal translator assumes that all languages have something in common, that there is some universal languageality to language, that if you just pass it through the right thing, you can understand it. And I don't want to take this too seriously because, obviously Douglas Adams with the Babelfish, there's a fish in someone's ear and it's translating shit, and, it's crazy. So let's
not meant to be taken as a literal object at all.
Right, and clearly in Star Trek, the universal translator is just an object of convenience, in the same way that, the transporter for the original series was just there because it would have been too expensive to show the ship landing on the planet.
And warp drive. I mean, they're all MacGuffins, in a sense.
Yes. But with that said, I don't think we have to be super serious about this, but this idea that there is something basic to language, no matter what language it is, no matter who's speaking it, no matter how it came about, that is essentially similar, is an interesting idea, because I don't even think it's true of languages on Earth.
Well, here's where I would like to introduce a new example, and I don't know if you have much experience with this series or not, but this is the sci-fi series that I spent the most time with during my formative years, and it's Stargate. And Stargate is predicated, I'm thinking specifically of SG-1, the original series. It's predicated on the assumption that when we go to one of these other planets through the Stargate, generally speaking, they were seeded by a language from Earth. And even if the language has deviated a little bit from its source language on Earth, it's still based on something that we can translate if we just have the right Rosetta Stone, essentially. Now, usually there's a different Rosetta Stone for each situation in which this arises, but pretty much all of Season 1 and parts of other seasons too is this team going to other planets, trying to figure out which culture and language group that the planet was seeded from, and then basically setting loose their linguist and their anthropologist on, figuring out how to communicate with these people and usually prevent some catastrophe from happening or, negotiate with allies. So I think it's really interesting as an exploded out example of the same trend to look at Stargate as one long interrogation of the universal translator. They're essentially doing the work of the universal translator in every episode. They're trying to figure out the commonalities. They're trying to figure out how to translate it, but the assumption is that they can, that it's based on something recognizable and familiar and reducible to a set of translation steps. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of meat in the universal translator that could be interrogated in so many different contexts.
So I'm not familiar with the Stargate universe outside of my truncated experience with Stargate Universe, the series, not the franchise. So is it more accurate to say that these cultures were seeded on different planets after they had started to develop languages, and then the languages just developed separately? Or are we talking biological evolution. Like, these species were seeded on different planets, and they all developed languages that were understandable.
No, they're actually seeded with humans from different epochs and locations on Earth. So, for example, in one episode, you might go through and discover people in togas speaking ancient Greek. In another episode, you might go to another planet and discover a people group from Mongolia in the 1400s. I don't remember if those are I know that there was several ancient Greek-based cultures, and I know there was one that resembled Mongolian. I don't remember the eras from which they're taken, but the assumption of the Stargate original series is that the Goa'uld, the villains of seasons 1 through whatever, they kidnapped routinely people from Earth, from different places on Earth, different times on Earth, and took them across the universe and seeded them onto these other planets. And then their languages essentially stayed the same from that point. Like, they didn't evolve like they actually do on Earth in the intervening time, but they pretty much stayed static with a little bit of variation, not enough to pose a challenge to our excellent linguists. And then they're used for cannon fodder or human vessels or whatever it is that the Goa'uld need from human subjects. So, yeah, it's not that there are a lot of alien species in the original series, season 1, but you do start to see those alien species appear in subsequent seasons because I guess they kind of ran out of Earth-based cultures that were interesting enough to replicate on a limited soundstage in wherever they recorded this, Hollywood or whatever. Maybe Canada. It might be Canada. I don't remember where they filmed Stargate. But it is, essentially it's like their original assumption was, let's go with Earth-based cultures, and then once they decided that wasn't interesting enough to sustain, 12 seasons of the show, they started to branch out. And there's even a couple seasons dedicated to dealing with replicators, which are mechanical creatures. So, yeah, it doesn't stay there, but it starts there.
Speaking of alien cultures, I think that my favorite representation of both a universal translator and the breakdown of a universal translator is not actually from a book or a movie or show at all, but is from a computer game, Star Control 2, the Urquan Masters, which you will hear me probably talk a lot about. But there's a species in Star Control 2 called the Ors, for which, when you first encounter them, you get a message from your system computer that says, Universal Translator is really having a hard time with this one. Like, there's going to be some linguistic best fits. We're kind of throwing some things in here. We don't really understand what's going on with this language. And then that's exactly what happens. You get this mishmash of words that make sense, that are structured in a way that is sensical, mixed in with things like pretty bubbles and dancing and things. So it does it in the way that Star Control 2 does it is it presents alien verbs, alien nouns, alien language structures, alien sentence structures in a way that sort of translates them into English, but allows you to look at them without actually understanding any of the translation, only knowing that what you're seeing is alien, and alien to the point that it confuses your universal translator. It confuses your knowledge of sentence structure and word, sentence structure and parts of speech, and so forth. And I thought that was really smart, and it stands out in my mind as, many years later, something as a work of science fiction that seemed to really think about alien language and what it would take to make an alien language, especially if you have the convenient device of the universal translator present.
Sure. I hear that. I mean, now I have to go and play this game, right? Like, I'm not quite able to picture it, but I'll see if I can find a copy and play it. So what's next on our list of things to look at, Tony?
Yeah, so where I'd like to go next is thinking about what would it take to make linguistics the science of focus in a science fictional work. And Csicsery-Ronay kind of asked this question. He cites another scholar named Wallace E. Myers, Myers argued that the depiction of mutant and alien languages in science fiction should meet the same standards of plausibility as any other scientifically understood social phenomenon. Now, the result of this definition is that at the time of writing, Myers found that no works of science fiction, no alien languages, actually fulfilled this criteria. And in fact, there was only one work of fiction that involved invented languages that did. And that work of fiction was Lord of the Rings. Which is really interesting, because if you think of this in terms of the Myers definition, Lord of the Rings is a work of science fiction. In fact, it's the only work of linguistic science fiction.
Yeah.
And, it may, I think this happened a while ago. This is not new, and things may have happened, and we'll talk about other alien languages later in the podcast, including Klingon and what that has done. But Csicsery-Ronay follows this up and says, well, yeah, but obviously, if you asked someone, a science fiction fan, a science fiction academic, Lord of the Rings is fantasy and not science fiction for all of these reasons that we could go through. And yet, it's the only work that fulfilled this, that fulfilled Myers' criteria. And I think that's really interesting. So what do you have to say?
I mean, I think it's interesting because so many people would push back against the concept of Lord of the Rings being considered science fiction as opposed to fantasy. I think there's a little bit of territorialness, perhaps, and keeping the house in order, not letting the boundary get too blurred between the two. We have science fiction fantasy, but it's almost a third category. People don't want to accept Lord of the Rings as science fiction in a lot of places that I have been, at least. So, considering it the only true work of linguistic science fiction could present itself as rather problematic to people who have a vested interest in keeping the strains pure, so to speak. But I do think it's interesting to contrast, say, in comparison to something like Mary Doria Russell's The Sparrow and Children of God, where you have entire sections dedicated to the linguistic recognition of another culture, acquisition of communication skills with another society, an alien culture. It basically, it puts linguists on the front foot of its storyline and its plot, but it doesn't put them on the front foot in terms of, on the same scale at least, as Lord of the Rings does. It's Elvish and it's Orcish and it's other languages. It doesn't create an entire standalone language structure running parallel underneath the text that you can communicate sufficiently through. I think it's still probably operating on the found word level. Our linguists might sample a few words of the language on the foreign planet, but they're not going to actually spend the book communicating in it in a way that feels like the language is complete. I don't know if I'm very much rambling here, so stop me at any point. But I mean, does that strike you on the same? Did you have the same experience with Lord of the Rings? Does anyone allow it to be science fiction?
No, and I think that that's important because, on the one hand, you have Lord of the Rings as a series that, in almost every other way, is coded as fantasy. And yet, the attention that Tolkien paid to language development fulfills this very strict criteria of linguistic, not purity, but plausibility, linguistic plausibility, in a way that makes it linguistic science fiction. However, I think the difference is, or rather why I would not want to die on this particular hill, is that the language is not central. Tolkien developed it and he knew what he was doing and it meets this criteria of strong plausibility and so on and so forth. But we're not thinking about the languages in Lord of the Rings. They're there. They're in the background. They're part of this massive world that Tolkien has created. But the books are not about the language.
The fan culture might be. I mean, I have to throw this in there as someone who, when I was young and foolish, memorized the entire film scripts to the extended. I'm not even kidding. I can speak partial Elvish because I spent so much time memorizing the scripts and then exploding my knowledge of the vocabulary beyond what was in the films. There are people out there who can speak Elvish, who can speak Klingon, who can speak various other artificial languages that are meant to represent the other. And I think it's more the fan base that is responsible for bringing these languages to life, even than the authors who invented them in some cases, or the I don't know who created Klingon, but you're going to get to that eventually. So
yes, and I actually do want to talk about the fan response to alien languages, because I think that's super important for some of the reasons that you've highlighted and others. But let's not do that just yet.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
As a contrasting work, I was thinking about, because we've brought this up in previous podcasts, what is a work of linguistic science fiction? What is a story or a novel or a show or a movie or something that really thinks about language and forefronts it? Its science is linguistics. And we have a really great example coming up, the new movie Arrival, which is based on Ted Chiang's short story,
which I have yet to read,
Your Life.
But we will be doing a sort of post-watch party and talking about the short story and the movie.
Yes. We don't want to do too much with that story and the movie just yet, in part because it's not out and we haven't seen it.
Right.
But what's important, I think, about this particular story is that even though it's science fiction in a really traditional sense, you have aliens coming to Earth, a first contact situation, what do we do, how do we respond? It's thinking really smartly. It's thinking primarily through language, thinking about linguistic relativity, exploring the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in ways that other first contact stories, the other stories have not done. So I think it's a really great example of what can be done in terms of using linguistics as the science that is the focus of a piece of science fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. So I will postpone my final verdict on whether true linguistic science fiction exists until after I finish reading the short story and see the movie. It's worth pointing out that Arrival is going to be released on November 11th. So, mark your calendars for that. I don't know if I'll get to see it opening night, but we will be seeing it, shortly after its release, if not opening night, and then talking about it while it's fresh. So that's going to interrupt our sequence of podcasts probably at some point, just because it's always exciting to talk about fresh stuff.
So I've been putting on my academic hat a little bit during this podcast, and I want to a little bit more now, because I think what I want to do is draw a line between language and discourse.
Okay.
So language, when what we're talking about is really, language is putting the linguistic behavior at the forefront. So if we're talking about a spoken language, then it's not just the spoken language, it's body language as well, it's communication style, it's, what are you doing with your hands, what is your face doing, so on and so forth. But if we're thinking about discourse, then we're involving all kinds of contextual and social cues as well, thinking about, where are you speaking, who are you speaking to, what group are you a part of, and what does that have to do with the way that you're speaking? So I think that part of what you're describing is the difference, or is recognizing the difference between language and discourse.
Yeah, and I think when we think of our seminal first contact films, books, etc., often we're going to think of Contact, Carl Sagan, and film adaptation that followed.
With good reason.
With good reason, because the thing about first contact that's so fascinating is communication, right? And that first coming up against the others. So I think of first contact stories as most fascinating on the level of discourse, as you were mentioning and defining, and then secondarily on the level of actual communication behaviors. I think that the most fascinating thing about Contact is not the machine that allows her to actually communicate with the aliens in terms of behavior, but it's the mind, the other mind coming up against the human mind. And then what do we do with that? Do we become scared of it? Do we work to understand it? Etc. So that was really what fascinated me about First Contact, and that was what I wanted to go at full bore in what I was writing, and I was struggling through it. And I think that struggle gave me a lot more sympathy for what I would call failed First Contact novels, because I have started one myself. So yeah.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Contact to me, and has remained interesting, as I've visited and revisited both the book and the novel, the book and the novel? Since I have visited and revisited the novel and the movie, since I saw the movie in theaters in 1997 when I was 10 years old, is that essentially what Carl Sagan is doing is furthering this argument that mathematics and universal phenomena are themselves a language that can be understood outside of the trappings of specific language, of specific discourse. So by, saying that the alien's first transmission is the molecular weight of hydrogen times pi, I think it was, or by hiding alien messages deep in transcendental numbers, or not hiding alien messages, but hiding someone's messages deep inside transcendental numbers, he's saying that there is sort of this universal language that exists. And it is, in fact, not just a universal language in that everyone can understand it, but that it is the language of the universe. There is something in the structure of the universe itself that can be used to communicate.
I did not walk away from the movie feeling that at all. Like the language of the universe. Like, I know that there's various texts, even several that I've read recently, where they talk about the language of the gods or the original human language. And I do think that is an interesting concept, but it's not the superior concept of, I think it's the sort of thing which we've probably written about since Homer's time. So it's not necessarily the newest part of what Contact had to offer, the newest part. It wasn't the most revelatory part of the equation that Contact offered for me personally.
No, but it was a very interesting, I think it was a very interesting artifact of the time, because when I big deal. So sort of thinking about...
It's still a big deal. It's just considered an impossible big deal.
Right. But thinking about, a universal language, like there is language written into the universe itself that we can all understand if we just understand math or science or whatever it may be. Seems like a very, a very time-based idea. He was working with something that was not only of that time, but was also incredibly optimistic. And I don't want to dump on it exactly, but I also don't know that you would see it now, because I think we tend not to see that sort of optimistic science fiction anymore.
Well, and I think, so a perfect example of this change at work is several interviews that have been appearing on Science Friday and NPR lately with Anne Droyan and the rest of the team that with Carl Sagan put together the Voyager Golden Records. So this year is the anniversary, or was the anniversary, of the Golden Records and Voyager. And so they have been carrying out various anniversary specials and posting that online. And one of the things they did was they gathered together fan recommendations or follower recommendations on what people would want on the Golden Record today. And almost universally, or maybe not almost universally, but a regular trend among the suggestions was, let's show some of the negative shit that we do. Because on the original Golden Record, it was like music, it was pictures of, nice things for the most part. It was it was art, it was culture, but like refined, non-violent, pretty optimistic culture. And now people are saying, well, we didn't send any of the pictures of children getting sprayed with Agent Orange. We didn't send pictures of people in Nazi prison camps starving to death. We didn't send pictures of war. And these are what people today would consider primary modes of human behavior, maybe not the only modes of human behavior, but like war is an important social function. And if we want to represent ourselves honestly, we're going to send some of the negative shit along too with our Beethoven. And the answer by some of the panelists, and Kim Stanley Robinson was one of the panelists who helped select and curate a top 10 list or something like that. Their final kind of compromise was, well, now we can send just a thumb drive with all of this stuff on it, so we can let them choose what they want to, what they want to interpret humanity as. And I just think it's very interesting that now the conversation is about honesty. Whereas back in the day when Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan and the others were putting the original records together, it was about curating the best in humanity and sending a message out that was hyper-specific to human culture, that wasn't universal, but that if they did manage to interpret, would give them a really positive idea about what humanity is capable of. So I think that's interesting. I think that what we did with the Golden Record is a beautiful, enduring, and really interesting science fiction in and of itself. But we have other things to talk about. So
yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that, and I actually want to seize on something you just said about involving fans in that decision, and use that to make our final point for this podcast, which is going to, as we both promised multiple times, return to Klingon, the artificial language from the Star Trek universe, as well as the people and the culture and the society that it represents. And I mentioned those things because how Csicsery-Ronay ends this first chapter in his book is by talking about Klingon. And he says, Klingon, the language, raises fascinating questions about the performance of culture in contemporary life. The language itself is only one aspect of a project to create a full-fledged artificial culture in which every act and gesture is part of a total imaginary symbolic system. Elaborately codified rituals, funerals, initiations of adolescence, betrothals, and so forth appear to function for committed performers of Klingon quite similarly to traditional rituals performed in historical organic communities. And I find this so interesting. Not only because I read it and I was like, holy shit, that's awesome. Go people who have learned Klingon and actually have contributed to this artificial cultural creation. But also because one of my major critiques of this book is that it's limited to only 7 beauties. And the 8th beauty that sort of rose from its pages, that was ghosting through the pages as I was going through, is fan contribution, fan communities, what fans can do in response to science fiction that they don't necessarily do in response to other genres.
Absolutely.
And I think we're a great meta example of that. We are podcasting about a book of science fiction criticism, not about the book specifically, but using it as a jumping off point, like I said at the beginning. But we are part of that 8th beauty, that fan contribution to science fiction. The fans embracing it, doing things with it, taking a language, a fictional alien language like Klingon, and turning it into an artificial culture. And I almost don't want to use the word artificial because it sounds negative. And I think the way that he's using it and the way that I was thinking about it was just saying, this would not exist except that Star Trek is out there, except that the Klingon language is out there, and it takes dedicated fans to actually turn that into something. And that is just amazing.
Yeah. And their fan contributions have specific social functions in ordinary social situations. And I just think there are so many ways in which fan culture shapes how we behave and how we receive other people as well, who maybe don't share the same fan cultures as us, who maybe are more interested in Star Trek and we're more interested in Star Wars, although that separation has gotten crushed a little bit in recent years. But like, I don't know. Like, I think we're being naive if we think that fandom doesn't impact like ordinary day-to-day life. It does sometimes intensely.
Yeah, and the other thing that I want to mention in response to that, well, first of all, I sort of disagree with the idea that fandom is not ordinary everyday life, because I think for a lot of people it can be.
It can be, depending on their context.
Yes, definitely. Not necessarily is or isn't. So what's cool about this idea of fan communities and, fan recognition and fans embracing a language like Klingon and, developing it culturally, is that then you have that feeding back on the works that inspired their fandom in the first place. And that's so much more easy to accomplish now with the internet, although obviously there were, again, using Star Trek as an example, Star Trek conventions for decades before the internet existed. So it was not necessary, but it allows that sort of fandom interaction with the works themselves, with authors, with creators, with actors, in a way that you wouldn't have had so easily before. And that's why I call it really a beauty, because the fact that you can have all of these people, essentially these communities celebrating this thing that they enjoy, no matter what their personal stake is in it. If they're the creator, if they're a fan, if they're a fan creator, maybe they write fan fiction, maybe they've helped actively shape where the show or the book series or whatever is going because they have fan clubs or
whether it's created, period. There's a lot of material out there that would never make it past the development hell stage if there wasn't a significant fan backing. And I think of what fans did for Firefly in, basically not letting Fox or not letting Joss Whedon, whoever it was, forget that they really loved this show and that they wanted conclusion. I think that that's really beautiful. They fought for it. They, even in the age before, Twitter really took off, fans got behind this show and were like, let's bring it back, baby. Let's resuscitate this thing. And that's talking about something that's already ongoing. But you have to think about what producers and directors are thinking of as commercially viable material today. And where are they going to go to find out if it's commercially viable? They're going to go to social media. They're going to see what kind of interest is being expressed out there in popular magazines and in fan blogs and in journals and things like that. I imagine there's probably a shit ton of people on IO9 who are looking at it as a metric for determining where science fiction, television, and film goes next, because they're seeing what books really are leaping off the page, which ones are grabbing people as cinematic, and that sort of a thing. So I think I think that there's a lot to be said for fandoms shaping what comes next, in addition to responding to and fleshing out and celebrating the science fictional worlds that already exist.
Yes, I agree, and I think that is actually an excellent place to leave the podcast today.
Oh, okay. And what are we going to talk about next week or next podcast?
Oh, shit if I know. Where is this podcast going to come in the order? The only thing we know about this podcast is that it has to be released before November 11th because we said we haven't seen Arrival yet.
Yes, and we should also mention in our best worst Sean Connery action.
Yes, Mr. Connery, what should we mention?
We should mention that I am halfway through the final installment of the Southern Reach trilogy, so that is upcoming.
We will be talking in the very near future about Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy.
And we'll be talking about the second beauty at some point. And this might be a hard one to make tangible for our readers. So we're really going to try and find innovative ways to make it good. And because the second beauty is fictive novums. And Tony, can you just in 15 seconds or less define a fictive novum?
So a fictive novum, as used by Csicsery-Ronay here, as forwarded by the science fiction scholar Darko Suvin, is the central imaginary novelty in a work of science fiction. So it's the cool new thing, essentially. What is
this? Is it a MacGuffin? Does it have to be a MacGuffin?
No, it definitely does not. For example, as we were talking about The Left Hand of Darkness, Kemmer would be an excellent example of a novum because it's a new thing. We haven't really seen it before. It's what's central to the novel, even though there are other things going on. And there doesn't just have to be one novum in a book. There doesn't have to be one central imaginary novelty to a book or a show or a movie or whatever.
But it does have some sort of effect on the organization of the book. Am I correct in assuming that?
I would assume for the most part. I can't think of a work in which it wouldn't.
Okay, so we will be discussing possible MacGuffins and possible non-MacGuffin novums in a future podcast.
Yes.
So thank you for listening to us here on the Imaginaries ramble about things that are imaginary in science fiction, literature, film, television, and our own brains. Yes, we do sometimes talk to our imaginary friends on this podcast.
We certainly do not.
You can find us online at our website, www.imaginaries.us. We're not posting a whole lot there apart from our actual podcast links. You can also follow us on SoundCloud and iTunes. And we do promise we will be fleshing out our online presence in the future as we figure out what we want to do. And maybe you guys can be central to us figuring out what we want to do. So hop online, respond to us on our blog at imaginaries.us and, on SoundCloud if you happen to respond to things on SoundCloud. So thank you for listening to us and goodbye.